Three Native American sisters vanished in 1945 from an Indian boarding school in the United States. Their disappearance went unnoticed by most during this chaotic time. But one person, their biological older brother, never gave up the search. After 40 years, he makes a shocking discovery, a disturbing find that would change everything and expose the dark truth of what was really happening during that era in American history. The desert wind swept dust and regret through Whispering Rock, New Mexico, as Thomas Red Elk, 58, sat beside his rusted 1971 camper. It was 1985, and after 4 decades of searching, he had stopped here, tired, broken, and clinging to memories. Thomas, though his birth name was Ashki Yaji, and the boarding school had christened him Tommy, spread the yellowed newspaper across his lap with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. 40 years old this paper was, but he treated it like it was printed yesterday. The headline read, "Indian Boarding Schools, Forging America's Bright Future," and below it, a photograph that had haunted his dreams for 4 decades. 3 young girls sat on the wooden porch steps of a small chapel, their dark hair braided neatly, their white cotton dresses pressed and cleaned for the cameras. Behind them, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, stood a priest in black robes holding a Bible. Thomas knew every detail of that photograph, the way Sarah's hands were folded in her lap, how Naomi's left shoulder tilted slightly from an old injury, the serious expression on little Eva's face that made her look older than her 8 years. Those weren't their real names, of course. The boarding school had stripped those away, along with everything else. Sarah had been born Nazli, meaning she flows around in Diné, their grandmother's choice because the child had been born during the spring floods. Naomi was Elise, she is precious, and Ava was Aylin, joy. They had been his baby sisters, torn from their family in Cottonwood Bluffs when the Bureau of Indian Affairs came with their papers and their promises and their lies. Thomas took a long pull from his beer, letting the bitter liquid wash down the even more bitter memories. He had been 14 when they came for the 4 children, using their father's arrest as justification. Their father had resisted when government officials tried to seize their ancestral lands, and their mother had died giving birth to Aylin, leaving the children vulnerable to the federal assimilation policy that swept through Indian country like a plague. Wards of the state, they'd called them, as if being made orphans was some kind of gift. St. Gertrude Indian Boarding School had been their prison for years. The boys and girls were kept strictly separated, which meant Thomas rarely saw his sisters except during the mandatory morning mass and evening devotions. Even then, speaking to them in Diné was forbidden, punishable by days locked in the basement, or worse, the beatings that left marks hidden beneath their uniforms. But the worst day, the day that still woke him in cold sweats, had been in 1945, when he was 18. World War II was ending, but the discrimination against indigenous people remained as sharp as ever. The school had been preparing for weeks for what they called a press visit. Thomas remembered how they had lined up the children like products in a store window, the youngest ones placed prominently because their wide eyes and frightened expressions photographed well. His sisters had been chosen specifically for the photo session because of what the priest called their innocent beauty and their obvious fear, which the newspapers would interpret as reverence. The reporters had come with their bulky cameras and notepads, asking scripted questions about gratitude and salvation, while the priests nodded approvingly. They had taken dozens of photographs, including the one now spread across Thomas's lap. The next day, his sisters were gone. He had realized it first during morning mass when their usual spots in the girls' section remained empty. When evening devotion came and they still hadn't appeared, panic had set in. He had approached the guardians, asking desperately about his sisters, but they had refused to answer. Instead, they had beaten him for his insolence, locked him in the basement for 3 days, and told him to forget he'd ever had sisters at all. But Thomas couldn't forget. When the beatings intensified and still no information came, he had made his escape. At 18, he was technically an adult, and the school's half-hearted search efforts lasted only a few days. There had been no missing child flyers, no real police investigation, just the quiet understanding that one more Indian boy had disappeared into the vast American landscape, and no one in authority particularly cared. For 40 years he had wandered the Southwest in his camper, following whispers and rumors, showing that newspaper photograph to anyone who would look. He had survived on odd jobs, construction work when his back could handle it, small repairs for cash, occasional handouts from veteran shelters, despite never having served in the military. Whispering Rock had been his home for the last decade, not because he'd found any trace of his sisters, but because he'd finally given up. The town was dying, just like he was, and it seemed like an appropriate place to wait for the end. The beer bottle made a hollow sound as the last drops disappeared down his throat. Thomas cursed under his breath, folding the newspaper carefully and placing it back in the passenger seat where it lived. His hands were steadier when he had something to drink, steadier when the memories weren't quite so sharp around the edges. He climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, listening to the engine cough to life, like an old man clearing his throat. The liquor store was only 10 minutes away, the only liquor store in this tired little town, and Marta would be working behind the counter like she always was. The bell above the door chimed as Tommy entered, and Marta Dane looked up from behind the counter with a smile that held genuine warmth. She was in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that had seen enough of life to understand suffering without judgment. "Tommy," she said, her voice carrying a slight Spanish accent. "Let me guess, the beer ran out again?" He managed a weak smile in return. Marta was one of the few people in Whispering Rock who treated him like a human being rather than just another drunk Indian to be avoided. Their friendship had developed slowly over the past few years, built on small conversations and mutual respect. "You know me too well, Marta," Tommy replied, making his way to the cooler in the back of the store. He selected 6 bottles of the cheapest beer available and carried them to the counter. As he reached for his wallet, Tommy's heart sank. The crumpled bills in his pocket amounted to less than half of what he needed. He had forgotten about the money he had spent on gas the previous week, and his next disability check wasn't due for another 5 days. Marta watched him count and recount the bills, her expression growing concerned. "Tommy," she said gently, "you look sick and tired. When was the last time you had a real meal?" Tommy shrugged, embarrassed by his obvious poverty and the way alcohol had become the center of his existence. "Money's tight right now. I'll come back when my check arrives." But Marta leaned forward, her hands clasped on the counter. "I know this isn't easy for you, what you're dealing with. I've seen the newspaper you carry, seen the pain in your eyes. Maybe you could come to church with me this Sunday? You look like you could use it." Tommy's first instinct was to refuse. He had learned Catholic teachings at the boarding school, memorized countless prayers and biblical passages, but he had never found comfort in religion. If anything, Christianity reminded him of everything that had been taken from him. He had also long ago abandoned his traditional Navajo spirituality, feeling disconnected from both worlds. "Church isn't a place for someone like me, Marta," he said quietly. "I'm not religious, and I don't think your God would want me there." But Marta's eyes sparkled with determination. "Tell you what, if you come to church with me and stay for the entire service, I'll buy you these 6 bottles of beer. And if you're still not convinced that it helped, I'll throw in 2 extra bottles." Tommy looked at her skeptically. "You're trying to bribe me with alcohol to go to church? Isn't that against Catholic rules or something?" Marta laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Maybe it is. But sometimes God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes people need practical incentives to open their hearts to possibilities they hadn't considered." The offer was tempting, more than tempting, 8 bottles of beer for sitting through one church service seemed like a reasonable trade, especially since he had nothing else to do with his Sunday. And Marta's sincerity was hard to ignore. "Okay," Tommy said finally, "but I want to be clear. I'm doing this for the beer, not for salvation." Marta's smile widened. "That's honest, at least. The service starts in 30 minutes at Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish. It's not far from here. Just follow the main road toward the mountains and turn left at the big wooden cross." "Can you manage to stay sober for 30 minutes?" Tommy considered asking for just one beer now to steady his nerves, but something in Marta's expression made him reconsider. Okay, I'll meet you there." Back in his camper, Tommy searched through his few possessions for something appropriate to wear to church. His cleanest T-shirt was still stained and worn, but it would have to do. He splashed water on his face from a plastic jug, combed his graying hair with his fingers, and tried to make himself presentable. As he drove toward Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish, Tommy wondered what he was getting himself into. The church was a modest building with adobe walls and a simple wooden cross mounted above the entrance. Several cars were parked in the gravel lot, and he could see people in their Sunday clothes walking toward the main doors. Tommy parked his battered camper next to a pristine sedan and immediately felt self-conscious about the contrast. But Marta appeared at his elbow as soon as he stepped out, her face bright with welcome. "Thank you for coming, Tommy," she said, linking her arm through his. "I think this might be exactly what you need." Inside Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish, the afternoon light filtered through simple stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across wooden pews that had seen decades of worship and prayer. The church was modest but well-maintained, with whitewashed adobe walls and a simple wooden altar adorned with fresh desert flowers. Tommy followed Marta to a pew near the back, conscious of his worn clothing and the faint smell of beer that probably clung to him despite his attempts to clean up. He slumped into the hard wooden seat, arms crossed, waiting impatiently for the service to end so he could claim his promised beer. When the congregation stood for the opening hymn, Tommy reluctantly rose to his feet, mumbling along to words he half remembered from his boarding school days. When they sat, he sat. When they knelt, he remained seated, drawing a few disapproving glances that he ignored. The priest who approached the altar was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair. "That's Father Murphy," Marta whispered. "He's been here for 15 years. Good man." Tommy nodded absently, but then something caught his attention. To the other side of the room, just below the altar, stood a group of nuns that seemed somehow different from what he expected. He pointed them out to Marta, who followed his gaze with interest. "Usually the nuns aren't there," she whispered back. "And they're wearing different colored habits, longer ones too, different from the nuns from this church. Seems like there's something special happening today." The nuns wore black robes that reached to the floor, their faces partially obscured by their head coverings. There was something austere about their presence, a severity that reminded Tommy uncomfortably of the boarding school. But there was also something else. Most of them appeared to be indigenous women, their features familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Father Murphy's sermon washed over Tommy like background noise. He caught fragments about faith and perseverance, about God's plan revealing itself in unexpected ways, but his attention kept drifting to the nuns standing silently at the side of the altar. There was something about their stillness that seemed almost unnatural, as if they were statues rather than living women. When the service was nearly concluded, Father Murphy made an announcement that snapped Tommy back to attention. "Before we dismiss today, I want to let everyone know about a special opportunity. The sisters from the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna are visiting our church as part of their annual tour of Catholic churches throughout New Mexico. They're here to offer healing revival prayers, and everyone who feels the need for prayer is invited to receive it." Marta nudged Tommy gently. "You should approach the sisters," she said. It would be good for you." Tommy shook his head. "Let's go back. I fulfilled my side of the promise." "Well then, let's go back to the store," Marta agreed, but as they began to move toward the exit, Father Murphy approached them. He recognized Marta and smiled warmly. "Marta, how good to see you. And who did you bring with you today?" Marta introduced Tommy, and the priest extended his hand with genuine warmth. "It's wonderful to have you here, Thomas. I don't think I've seen you at our services before." Tommy found himself responding despite his intentions to remain aloof. "It's been a while since I went to church. Used to do it when I was at a boarding school. I almost forgot all those Bible teachings, but what you said today gave me some inspiration." Something in Tommy's manner encouraged Father Murphy to continue the conversation. Perhaps it was the pain that lived behind his eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly, but the priest seemed to recognize a soul in need of healing. As they talked, Tommy found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He confessed his struggles with alcohol, his battles with pain that never seemed to end, though he carefully avoided mentioning his missing sisters. That wound was too deep, too personal to share with a stranger, no matter how kind. When Tommy finished, the priest spoke quietly about the visiting nuns. "The sisters from the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna live very solemn lives," he explained. "They're devoted entirely to prayer and Catholic teaching. They've taken vows of silence and celibacy, and they don't interact with the public except during their Healing Month and this annual event when they visit churches throughout New Mexico." He gestured toward the black-robed figures. "You don't even have to speak to them. Just write your prayer request on one of the forms, light a candle, and put your request in the box where they stand. They'll pray for those requests when they return to their monastery. Then, in a few weeks, they'll write replies on the back of the prayer forms to deliver God's message. The church will return those papers to you." Tommy considered this, intrigued despite himself. "So the nuns will write exactly what God tells them for each individual prayer request?" "That's right," Father Murphy confirmed. Marta encouraged him again, and Tommy found his curiosity piqued. He had never heard of anything quite like this before. Maybe he could ask God about his sisters, about where they might be. It seemed worth trying, especially since it required no real commitment on his part. So he walked to the front of the church, his footsteps echoing slightly on the tile floor. At a small table, he found prayer forms and a pen. His handwriting was shaky as he wrote his name and his request, the words coming from a place of desperation he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Guided by one of the silent sisters, he lit a candle, the flame dancing in the still air of the church. He awkwardly crossed himself, the gesture feeling foreign after so many years away from formal religion, then approached the box where the 5 nuns stood guard. Up close, he could see that most of the nuns did indeed have indigenous features, and the sight filled him with conflicted emotions. It reminded him too vividly of the boarding school, of the way indigenous children had been forced to participate in their own cultural destruction. But there was also something else, a familiarity that he couldn't quite place. The prayer box was nearly full, and Tommy had to press his folded form down firmly to fit it inside. As he did so, he looked up at the nun standing closest to the box and felt compelled to speak. "If you're right about this," he said quietly, "if your God is stronger than our traditional spirits, then he should be able to tell me where my 3 missing sisters are. If he does, I'll be a devoted Catholic for the rest of my life." Tommy smiled slightly, hoping to connect with these women who shared his heritage, but none of the nuns smiled back. However, he noticed their expressions shift subtly when he mentioned his missing sisters. There was something in their eyes, perhaps a level of empathy, but he couldn't interpret. As he turned to walk back to Marta and Father Murphy, Tommy glanced over his shoulder one last time. He watched as the nun who had caught his attention lifted the heavy prayer box to carry it to a side room. She limped noticeably as she walked, favoring her right leg, and nearly stumbled under the box's weight. When she reached the door and pulled it open, a gust of wind from outside caught her habit, causing it to flutter against her face. For just a moment, Tommy caught a clear glimpse of her left temple, and his heart nearly stopped. There, partially hidden by her habit, was a thick, raised scar running along her left sideburn. The sight hit Tommy like a physical blow. Naomi had borne a scar in the same place, a memento from the day she had tried to protect little Eva from a particularly cruel nun wielding a wooden ruler. Tommy had learned about the incident weeks later when Naomi had whispered the story to him after morning mass, her voice shaking with remembered pain and fear. Tommy started to call out, his mouth opening to form his sister's name, but the door closed with a soft click before he could make a sound. The moment passed, leaving him standing frozen in the middle of the aisle, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Another sister approached him and gestured silently for him to move along, pointing to the small line of people that had formed behind him. Tommy mumbled an apology and forced his feet to carry him back to where Marta and Father Murphy waited, his mind reeling with the impossible possibility that he had just seen his long-lost sister. Tommy walked back to where Marta and Father Murphy stood near the altar, his mind still reeling from what he had witnessed. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I saw one of the nuns limping, and it caught my attention, reminded me of something from the past." Father Murphy's expression grew concerned. "Are you all right? You look pale." Tommy took a deep breath, realizing that the moment had arrived to share what he had kept buried for so long. "Father, I need to tell you something. I had 3 sisters, and they've been missing for 40 years. They were taken from our boarding school, St. Gertrude Indian Boarding School in Cottonwood Bluffs." The priest's eyes widened with sympathy. "Taken? What happened?" "It was 1945, Tommy continued, the words coming easier now that he had started. "There was a press visit, reporters taking pictures of the school to show how well the assimilation program was working. After that day, my sisters just vanished. The school officials wouldn't tell me anything. When I kept asking questions, they beat me and locked me up." He paused, gathering strength. "I checked on the boarding school years later. It's abandoned now, falling apart, but the pain of losing them, it's never left me." Tommy's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "We came from an indigenous Navajo family. First, we were separated from our father when they arrested him for resisting land seizure. Then I was separated from my sisters. I've been searching for them ever since, but I've never found any trace of where they went." Father Murphy placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "I cannot imagine the anguish you've carried all these years. What guidance are you seeking?" "How do I forgive?" Tommy asked, his voice cracking. "How do I move on from all of this? The anger, the loss? I drink to forget, but it never really goes away." Father Murphy was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Have you ever heard of Abraham from the Bible?" he asked finally. "He waited decades for God to fulfill his promise of a son. Abraham had to learn patience and faith, even when everything seemed hopeless. Sometimes God's timing is not our timing, but his answers do come." The priest gestured toward the front of the church where Tommy had just submitted his prayer request. "I truly believe you should wait for God's answer to the prayer you just made. Many members of my congregation have received responses from the Handmaid Sisters, and they've found them to be remarkably accurate and meaningful. Perhaps this is how God will finally speak to you about your sisters." Tommy felt a spark of hope, but his mind was also full of questions. "Father, can you tell me more about these nuns, the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna? Who founded their order, and why do most of them appear to be indigenous women?" Father Murphy's demeanor shifted noticeably. "The founder was Father Milford. He passed away many years ago. His son, Father Milford II, continues the ministry now. We are not allowed to talk about this. They are a sacred missions." "But why are most of the nuns indigenous?" Tommy pressed. And where is their monastery? I'd like to visit them to understand their work better." The priest shook his head firmly. "I can't provide information about their monastery location. The Handmaid Sisters are a very private and reclusive Catholic mission group. They operate what they call a sanctuary for women in prayer and penance. They've taken strict vows of silence and practice extreme modesty. No contact, no visitors. They're completely cut off from the outside world except for these annual church visits." Tommy sensed there was more that Father Murphy wasn't telling him, but the priest's body language made it clear the conversation was over. Marta stepped forward, breaking the awkward silence. "Well, Tommy, I think it's time I fulfill my side of our bargain," she said with a smile. They excused themselves from Father Murphy and walked back to the parking lot. The afternoon heat shimmered off the gravel as they reached their vehicles. "I'll meet you back at the store," Marta said, climbing into her car. Tommy drove his camper through the dusty streets of Whispering Rock, his mind churning with everything that had happened. At the liquor store, Marta kept her promise, handing him 8 bottles of beer with a gentle admonition. "Try not to finish all 8 in one day," she said kindly, "and maybe we can go to church again next week?" Tommy nodded absently, his thoughts still on the limping nun and her distinctive scar. Back at his camper, he noticed a piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. He pulled it free and saw it was a flyer announcing the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna Annual Church Tour with a schedule of upcoming visits to various churches throughout New Mexico over the coming weeks. Tommy folded the flyer without reading it thoroughly and opened one of his beers. As he started the camper's engine and took a long swig, he drove past Holy Martyrs of the Desert Parish one more time. This time he saw the 5 nuns emerging from the church and climbing into a plain white van. A young church volunteer carried several boxes, presumably containing the prayer requests, and loaded them into the van's rear compartment. Curiosity overwhelmed Tommy's original plan to return to his usual parking spot. He pulled out the flyer again, hoping to find an address for the monastery, but there was nothing other than instructions to visit the churches on their tour schedule to submit prayers. Since Father Murphy had refused to provide the monastery's location, Tommy decided to follow the van and see where these mysterious nuns actually lived. His curiosity was fueled partly by the hope of uncovering more about the limping nun, but more deeply by a need to understand why so many indigenous women had joined this secluded Catholic order. Maybe someone there had seen his sisters, or maybe they had even become part of it. He only hoped that those women had they found a better life than the one he remembered from the boarding school. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon when Tommy began following the van out of Whispering Rock. He stayed well back, keeping several car lengths between them to avoid detection. The van headed east toward the mountains, and as they drove further from town, the landscape became increasingly desolate. Scrub brush and yellow grasses stretched toward distant peaks, broken only by the occasional weathered fence post or abandoned homestead. After nearly an hour of driving through this remote terrain, Tommy spotted something unexpected in the distance. A large compound surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with what appeared to be prayer flags rather than barbed wire. A sturdy gate blocked the entrance, and beside it stood a small guardhouse. Tommy pulled off the road and parked behind a cluster of desert brush, watching as the white van approached the gate. A young Native American man emerged from the guardhouse, stoic and alert, scanning the area suspiciously before opening the gate to allow the van inside. From his concealed position, Tommy studied the compound. This was nothing like the peaceful monastery he had imagined. The buildings looked worn and utilitarian, more like a prison or detention facility than a place of spiritual contemplation. The presence of fencing and an armed guard only reinforced this impression. As the gate closed behind the van, Tommy remained hidden among the brush, his beer growing warm in his hand as he tried to process what he was seeing. Tommy remained parked behind the desert brush for nearly half an hour, watching the compound for any signs of activity and contemplating whether he should approach the watchman at the gate. The afternoon sun beat down on his camper's metal roof, but outside, nothing moved behind the chain-link fence except the occasional flutter of the prayer flags in the hot wind. While he waited, Tommy reached into a small cabinet beside his makeshift bed and pulled out an old wooden cigar box that had traveled with him for 4 decades. The box was worn smooth from handling, its corners rounded and its finish faded to a dull brown. Inside were the few precious items he had managed to salvage from his old life, the fragments of identity that the boarding school hadn't been able to destroy. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The first item was a collection of brittle school photographs, their edges cracked and yellowed with age. Most showed groups of children in identical uniforms, their faces solemn and distant. But there was one photo he treasured above all others, a candid shot of his 3 sisters sitting together on the dormitory steps, taken by a sympathetic kitchen worker who had given it to him in secret. Beneath the photographs lay his most precious possession, a piece of turquoise set in silver, suspended from a leather cord that had grown soft and dark with wear. Tommy lifted the pendant carefully, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. His father had made 4 identical pendants, one for each of his children, during the winter before they were taken away. The turquoise was a deep robin's egg blue with veins of darker stone running through it like ancient rivers. Tommy turned the pendant over and traced the engraved Navajo symbols on the back with his fingertip. Ashki Yaji, he whispered, his real name etched in the traditional script that connected him to generations of ancestors. His father had told him the pendant would protect him and help him remember who he truly was, no matter how far he traveled from home. The last item in the box was a folded piece of paper that looked like trash but held immeasurable value to Tommy. It was an old lunch menu from the boarding school kitchen, printed on cheap paper that had somehow survived 40 years of careful handling. But it wasn't the menu itself that mattered. It was what Tommy had drawn on the back during one of many sleepless nights in the dormitory. The pencil sketch was faded but still clear. His 3 sisters in a moment of rare tenderness, with Naomi gently braiding Eva's long hair while Sarah sat nearby, her mouth open in song. Tommy had been gifted at drawing, and sketching had been his only escape from the harsh realities of boarding school life. He had created this image from memory after an evening when he had glimpsed his sisters together during chapel, and it captured a moment of love and sisterhood that the school's rigid discipline couldn't completely suppress. Now, comparing the sketch to his memory of the limping nun at the church, Tommy felt his heart race. The eyes were the same shape, the mouth had the same gentle curve, and most telling of all was the distinctive scar on the left temple. Naomi had gotten that scar defending little Eva from a particularly cruel nun who had been beating her with a wooden ruler. The wound had healed badly, leaving a thick, raised mark that no amount of time could erase. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of the compound gate opening. Tommy looked up to see a smaller car, a modest sedan, driving out of the facility. As the gate swung wide, he caught a brief glimpse of the interior courtyard. 2 figures in black habits stood near the main building, and even from this distance, Tommy could see they were embracing. One of them appeared to be wiping her eyes, and the other was gently stroking her back in a gesture of comfort. Before Tommy could process what he was seeing, a third figure, someone in regular clothes, appeared and firmly guided both nuns back toward the building. The gate closed with a metallic clang, cutting off his view. Tommy frowned, disturbed by what he had witnessed. Why would nuns in a supposed sanctuary be crying? He was certain he wasn't drunk. He had only had half a beer, and he wasn't hallucinating. The sedan that had left was now disappearing around a bend in the road, too far away for Tommy to follow. Instead, he slipped the turquoise pendant over his neck, letting it rest against his chest where his father had intended it to be worn, and climbed out of his camper. The walk to the compound gate took several minutes across the rough desert terrain. As he approached, the young Navajo watchman stepped out of his guardhouse, his hand resting casually but meaningfully on what appeared to be a radio. "You can't be here," the watchman said firmly. "This is private property. No public access." Tommy raised his hands peacefully. "I'm not looking for trouble, brother. I just want to know if this is really the monastery for the Handmaid Sisters of St. Dymphna. I'd like to speak with Father Milford II. The watchman's eyes narrowed. "Who are you, and why are you looking for Father Milford?" "His office isn't here. It's in Santa Dolorosa. Only the sisters live here." Instead of answering directly, Tommy pulled the turquoise pendant from beneath his shirt, letting it catch the afternoon light. The watchman's expression immediately changed as he recognized the traditional Navajo craftsmanship and the sacred symbols carved into the silver setting. They looked at each other for a long moment, two indigenous men standing in the desert, both understanding the significance of what hung around Tommy's neck. In Diné belief, turquoise was sacred and protective, a connection to the earth and sky that no amount of cultural suppression could break. "I can't help you much," the watchman said finally, his voice lower now, "even though you're a brother. But if you want answers, you need to talk to Father Milford II directly. His office is in Santa Dolorosa." He pointed toward the mountain road. "Follow this road east for about 30 miles. Don't tell anyone I gave you the address." The watchman glanced nervously toward the compound buildings. "You need to leave now. This isn't a good place for an indigenous man to be hanging around." Tommy started to turn away, but something made him stop. "Brother, are the sisters safe here? I saw some of them at church today. Most were indigenous women like us. And just now I saw nuns crying inside your gate. Are they being saved here? Or something else?" The watchman's face went completely stone, but Tommy could see fear flicker in his eyes. "We all play our parts here," he said quietly. "My part is to keep my mouth shut and keep everyone I care about safe. That's all I can tell you." His voice became urgent. "Go. Now I've helped you enough." Tommy thanked him and walked back to his camper. The drive to Santa Dolorosa took Tommy through winding mountain roads that cut between red rock formations and sparse desert vegetation. As his camper climbed into the higher elevations, the air grew slightly cooler, though the afternoon sun still blazed overhead with unforgiving intensity. When he finally reached the outskirts of Santa Dolorosa, a strange sense of familiarity washed over him. Something about the landscape, the arrangement of buildings nestled against the mountainside, triggered a memory from decades past. As he drove through the main street, his suspicion was confirmed when he spotted several weathered road signs that hadn't been updated, remnants bearing the town's previous name, Cielo Seco. Tommy pulled over and stared at one of the old signs, memory flooding back. He had been here 20 years ago, during his desperate search for his sisters that had taken him across the Southwest. Back then, he had met a kind man, a researcher or scientist of some sort who had been collecting plant samples in the mountains. Tommy had been exploring a narrow canyon, following a rumor about missing indigenous children when he had nearly fallen into a deep chasm. The stranger had grabbed his arm and pulled him to safety, probably saving his life. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of the few moments of human kindness he had encountered during his long years of searching. But he pushed it aside now, focusing on his current mission. He needed to find Father Milford II's office. Tommy's camper was running low on gas, and his wallet contained barely enough money to fill the tank for the return journey to Whispering Rock. He considered buying a local map at a gas station, but decided he couldn't afford the expense. Instead, he stopped at several businesses to ask for directions, describing the address the watchman had given him. After nearly an hour of searching and asking around, Tommy finally located the building. It was on a quiet residential street on the edge of town, and his heart skipped when he saw the same sedan that had left the compound earlier parked directly in front. The building itself was not what Tommy had expected for a religious office. Rather than a formal church administrative building, it was a modest single-story house with adobe walls and a red tile roof, the kind of residence that might belong to any middle-class family in the area. Tommy parked his camper across the street and studied the sedan. Through its windows he could see it was empty, though the engine hood suggested it had been driven recently. He touched the turquoise pendant at his throat for courage and approached the front door of the house. His plan was straightforward. Ask Father Milford II directly about the indigenous women in his monastery. If the priest had been working with native communities for years, perhaps he had heard something about 3 sisters who had disappeared from a boarding school decades ago. It was a long shot, but Tommy had learned to pursue every possible lead. He knocked firmly on the wooden door, expecting to wait for someone to answer. Instead, the door shifted slightly under the pressure of his knocks, swinging inward a few inches. The house was unlocked. "Hello?" Tommy called out, pushing the door open wider. "Father Milford? I'm here about the monastery. Can we talk?" No response came from inside the house. Tommy hesitated, knowing he was technically trespassing, but something about the situation felt wrong. The unlocked door and the complete silence, it suggested trouble. He stepped inside, continuing to call out as he entered a modest living room with simple furniture and religious artwork on the walls. That's when he noticed the dirt streaks on the floor, long smears of mud and dust that led from the front door deeper into the house like someone had been dragged. "Hello, is anyone here?" Tommy called again, following the dirt trail down a narrow hallway. The streaks were accompanied by what looked like red scratches on the white walls, marks that could have been made by fingernails clawing for grip. The trail led him through the house to a back door that was partly open to the wilderness behind the property. Just outside, cut into the natural rock formation of the mountainside, was a set of stone stairs descending into what appeared to be an underground cellar or cave. The kind of space that might be used for wine storage, Tommy thought initially. But then he heard sounds that made his blood run cold. A woman's voice crying and pleading, the crack of what sounded like a whip or leather strap, and underneath it all, a man's voice reciting biblical passages in a tone that was both fervent and menacing. "The Lord shall punish the wicked and cast down false gods," the voice intoned. "Discipline purifies the soul and conquers the heathen spirits that corrupt the faithful." Tommy crept closer to the cave opening, his heart pounding. Through the stone entrance he could see flickering candlelight and movement, shadows dancing against the rough walls. The woman's cries became more desperate, punctuated by the sound of blows. When Tommy saw a figure moving at the cave's mouth, someone in religious robes ascending the stairs, he knew he had stumbled into something far more sinister than he had imagined. This wasn't a holy place of prayer and contemplation. This was a place of torture and abuse. Tommy turned and ran, moving as quickly and quietly as he could back through the house and out the front door. His hands shook as he started his camper and drove away, his mind racing with the implications of what he had witnessed. He needed help, and he needed it immediately. The police station was easy to find, a small building near the town center with 2 patrol cars parked outside. Tommy pulled into the parking lot, took a deep breath, and prepared to report what might be the most important information of his life. Tommy burst through the doors of the Santa Dolorosa police station, his heart still racing from what he had witnessed at Father Milford's house. The small building smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke, with fluorescent lights humming overhead. 2 officers sat at metal desks, looking up with mild irritation at the interruption. "I need to report a crime," Tommy said breathlessly. "There's a woman being tortured in an underground cellar at Father Milford II's house. I heard screaming, whipping sounds. Someone needs to go there right now." The older officer, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a sheriff's badge, looked Tommy up and down with obvious disdain. "Slow down there, Chief. What's your name and what exactly are you claiming happened?" Tommy quickly explained what he had witnessed at the modest house, describing the dirt streaks, the red scratches on the walls, and the horrific sounds coming from the underground chamber. As he spoke, he could see the officer's expressions growing more skeptical. "You smell like alcohol?" the sheriff interrupted, wrinkling his nose. "How much have you been drinking today?" "I had 1 beer hours ago," Tommy protested. "That's not the point. There's a woman being hurt right now, and you need to—" "Hold on," the younger officer interjected. "You're talking about Father Milford II, the Catholic priest?" "Yes. Look, I know how this sounds, but I saw—" The sheriff stood up abruptly, his face flushing with anger. "Now you listen here, you crazy Navajo. Father Milford II is one of the most respected men in this town. He wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone torture anybody. And those nuns you're babbling about? They're all safely up at their monastery in the mountains. Nobody's ever seen them in town, let alone in some underground cellar." Tommy felt his desperation rising. "Please, just send someone to check the house. It'll take 5 minutes to verify—" "That's a pretty big accusation you're making here," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "You're talking about breaking and entering onto private property, making slanderous claims about a man of God. You admit you entered his house without permission. I could detain you right now for trespassing." "I didn't break in," Tommy insisted. "The door was unlocked, and I heard someone in distress. Don't you have an obligation to investigate?" The sheriff walked over to a shelf along the wall where religious items were displayed: a wooden cross, a statue of the Virgin Mary, rosary beads, and several framed photographs. He picked up 2 of the photos and held them out for Tommy to see. "This here is Father Milford, the founder of the mission," the sheriff said, pointing to the first photo. "Died about 15 years ago. And this is his son, Father Milford II, who continues his father's holy work." Tommy's blood turned to ice as he stared at the second photograph. The face looking back at him was unmistakably the same man from his treasured newspaper clipping, the priest who had stood behind his 3 sisters on the chapel porch 40 years ago. Older now, with gray hair and deeper lines around his eyes, but definitely the same person. This town has been blessed with peace since Father Milford II had his revelation that God wanted us to change our name from Cielo Seco to Santa Dolorosa, the sheriff continued reverently. "We've had the lowest crime rate in the county ever since. That man is practically a saint." Tommy realized with growing horror that the local law enforcement essentially worshipped Father Milford II. Any accusation against the priest would be dismissed automatically, regardless of evidence. The sheriff's voice turned cold and final. "I'm warning you one last time. Leave this town and don't come back. If you make another crazy accusation like this, I'll have you detained for disturbing the peace and making false reports. Get out of here before I change my mind about letting you go." Tommy left the police station with his hands trembling from adrenaline and frustration. In his camper, he tried to steady his breathing and think clearly. The local authorities were useless. Worse than useless, they were blinded by devotion to the priest. He needed help from someone he could trust. Tommy drove to the nearest gas station and found a payphone outside. From his glove compartment, he retrieved a worn address book he had carried for years and flipped through the pages until he found the number he was looking for. Clyde Yazzie, the researcher whose life he had saved 20 years ago in these very mountains. With shaking fingers, Tommy dialed the number and waited for an answer. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Yazzie residence." "Clyde, this is Tommy, Thomas Red Elk. We met about 20 years ago near Cielo Seco. You were doing some kind of research work in the mountains. I'm not sure if you remember me?" There was a pause. "Tommy? Jesus, where are you calling from? Are you still in the area?" "I'm in Santa Dolorosa. I realized they changed the name from Cielo Seco. Clyde, I need your help. I'm still searching for my sisters, and I think I've found something. There's a Catholic priest named Father Milford II, and I witnessed him torturing a woman in an underground cellar at his house." Clyde's voice became skeptical. Tommy, that's a serious accusation. Are you sure about what you saw? I'm dead serious. I heard a woman screaming, the sound of whipping, and this priest reciting Bible verses about punishing heathens. When I tried to report it to the local police, they dismissed me completely. They worshiped this priest, told me to leave town or they'd arrest me. Look, I don't know. Clyde, Tommy interrupted, his voice growing desperate. 20 years ago, you were collecting plant samples near that canyon system. I grabbed your arm when you nearly fell into the chasm. I saved your life. You told me if I ever needed anything, I could call you. Well, I'm calling in that debt now. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Clyde spoke again, his tone was entirely different. Where are you right now? Gas station on the main road through Santa Dolorosa, the Chevron station. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't move. True to his word, Clyde arrived quickly in a dusty pickup truck. He was older now, his hair mostly gray, and his face weathered by 2 decades of southwestern sun, but Tommy recognized him immediately. Clyde stepped out of his truck and approached the payphone where Tommy waited. "Tell me everything," Clyde said without preamble. Tommy recounted the entire story, the church service, the limping nun with the distinctive scar, following the van to the compound, meeting the watchman, and finally witnessing the torture at Father Milford's house. As he spoke, he watched Clyde's expression change from skepticism to concern to outright alarm. The local police won't help because they're basically in this priest's pocket, Tommy concluded. When I saw his photograph at the police station, I recognized him from a newspaper photo I've carried for 40 years. He's the same priest who was at my sister's boarding school the day they disappeared. Clyde nodded grimly. You're right about the local police. They won't help 2 Navajo men make accusations against a respected Catholic priest, but we have other options. We need to contact the Navajo Nation Police Department. They have jurisdiction when crimes involve tribal members, and they can force the local authorities to act. You know someone there? My cousin Joe works for the tribal police. He handles liaison work with local law enforcement. Let me call him. Clyde went inside the gas station to use the phone while Tommy waited outside, pacing nervously. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Every minute that passed meant more potential suffering for whoever was being held in that underground chamber. After 15 minutes, Clyde emerged with a grim expression. Joe's on his way with a team. He said this kind of situation, involving religious institutions and missing tribal members, requires immediate investigation. They'll meet us at the priest's house, but he warned us to stay back and hide and let them handle it. We're going back there? We need to be witnesses, and if this woman really is your sister. Clyde left the sentence unfinished. I'm not sure, Clyde, whether she's my sister or not, but she needs help. They decided to take Clyde's pickup truck instead of Tommy's conspicuous camper. As they drove back toward Father Milford's house, Tommy felt his heart hammering against his ribs. After 40 years of searching, he might finally have answers, though the circumstances were more horrific than anything he had imagined. They parked behind a cluster of desert shrubs about 100 yards from the house, positioning themselves where they could observe without being seen. The same sedan was still parked in front, and lights were visible through the windows. There, Clyde whispered, pointing toward the house. 2 men in white linen garments, the kind worn by certain religious orders, were carrying a limp figure toward the sedan. Even from a distance, Tommy could see the woman was wearing the black habit of a nun. Her head lolled against one man's shoulder, and dark stains were visible on both her clothing and the men's white garments. Blood, Tommy breathed. Look at her face. The woman's nose and cheeks were streaked with blood, and she appeared barely conscious. The men were struggling to support her weight as they approached the car, clearly intending to transport her somewhere. Before they could load her into the vehicle, the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the desert air. The 2 men froze, looking around frantically as 3 vehicles appeared on the road. 2 marked units from the Navajo Nation Police Department, and 1 unmarked SUV. "That's Joe," Clyde said, pointing to a tall man stepping out of the lead vehicle. Tommy and Clyde emerged from their hiding place and approached the scene. Clyde pointed Tommy toward his cousin, a serious-looking man in his 40s wearing a tribal police uniform. The confrontation that followed was tense and chaotic. Father Milford II emerged from the house, his face a mask of righteous indignation as he faced the tribal officers. He was exactly as Tommy remembered from the newspaper photo, though older and wearing civilian clothes stained with what appeared to be blood. "This is private property belonging to the Catholic Church," Father Milford declared. "You have no jurisdiction here. This woman is a member of our religious community receiving spiritual counseling." "Sir, we have reports of assault and possible kidnapping involving tribal members," Joe responded firmly. "We need to speak with this woman and examine the premises." Within minutes, the local Santa Dolorosa police arrived, forced to respond to the presence of tribal authorities. The sheriff, who had dismissed Tommy earlier, looked mortified to find himself in the middle of a jurisdictional confrontation involving his beloved priest. Father Milford continued to protest, claiming religious sanctuary and insisting the underground chamber was merely a wine cellar for Holy Communion. But when the tribal officers helped the injured woman from the car, her condition became undeniable. She was so weak she couldn't stand, blood covered her face, and her habits were torn and stained. Tommy stepped closer, his heart pounding as he studied the woman's face. Despite the injuries and the passage of 4 decades, he recognized her immediately. The distinctive scar on her left temple, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her mouth even in pain. "Elise?" he called out, using her Navajo name. "Naomi?" The woman's head turned weakly at the sound, and when her eyes managed to focus on Tommy's face, she gasped. Breaking her vow of silence for the first time in 40 years, she spoke in halting Diné. "Brother? Ashki Yaji? Tommy?" Everyone present, police officers, tribal authorities, even Father Milford, stared in shocked silence. Tommy stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "This is one of my 3 missing sisters," he announced to the assembled group. "She disappeared from St. Gertrude Indian Boarding School 40 years ago." Medical emergency services were immediately called. Police and tribal officers searched the house and underground chamber, returning 20 minutes later with Father Milford and his 2 assistants in handcuffs. As the priest was led to a patrol car, he turned toward Tommy with venomous hatred in his eyes. "Your false ancestral gods are powerless against the true faith," he spat. "Your pagan beliefs corrupt the pure souls I was trying to save." An officer placed a firm hand on Father Milford's head and pushed him into the back seat before he could say more. When the medical team arrived, they began examining Naomi with her consent. "I am no longer a nun as of this moment," she told them firmly. "Do what you need to do." The paramedics discovered fresh whip marks on her back, arms, and legs, clear signs of prolonged, systematic abuse. As they administered IV fluids to Naomi, Joe walked over to Tommy and Clyde, who stood near the ambulance. "We searched that underground chamber," Joe said, his face grim. "It's deeply disturbing. There was communion wine down there, and it appears he was forcing her to drink it while beating her. But that's not the strangest part." Naomi, overhearing, nodded weakly. "He made us drink wine to open our spirits to receive divine messages. When we couldn't produce the answers he wanted, he punished us." "There's a large statue of the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus," Joe continued. "But there's also a small setup for traditional Navajo spiritual rituals. It's like he was mixing indigenous beliefs with Catholicism." Naomi confirmed this with a bitter laugh. "We were forced to provide responses to individual prayer requests, like the one you submitted at the church. He believed indigenous women had special connections to spiritual worlds and were better at communicating with the Virgin Mary." Clyde shook his head in disgust. "This is wrong on so many levels." Only the indigenous nuns were beaten, Naomi continued, her voice growing clearer. The white nuns were never touched. He would give us wine and force us to meditate while intoxicated, claiming it would help us receive visions. When I refused to drink, wanting to stay sober to receive authentic messages from God, he punished me severely. Tommy grasped his sister's hand. What about Sarah and Eva? Are they safe? They learned to play by his rules, Naomi said quietly. They're still at the monastery. They've been faking spiritual messages for years to avoid punishment, just like everyone else. She paused, lost in the weight of memory. It's easier to figure out what answers people seek when they've written down their prayers, she added, her voice heavy with experience. Tommy nodded, the pieces falling into place. I think I might have seen them at the compound gate. 2 women crying, he said, uncertainty in his voice. That place didn't even look like a monastery to me when I first saw it. Joe placed a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. We're coordinating with state authorities to search the monastery in the mountains. We'll bring Sarah and Eva to you at the hospital. As Naomi was loaded into the ambulance, Tommy climbed in beside her. Clyde followed in his truck as they drove toward the regional hospital, sirens wailing through the desert evening. The Regional Medical Center's waiting room was a sterile space filled with uncomfortable plastic chairs and the antiseptic smell that permeated all hospitals. Tommy sat beside Clyde, both men still processing the enormity of what had just unfolded. Naomi had been rushed into the emergency treatment area immediately upon arrival, the medical team working quickly to assess her injuries and flush the alcohol from her system. A life for a life, Tommy said quietly, staring at his hands. Now you've helped save my sisters. Clyde nodded, remembering. That's how it should be, Navajo brothers helping each other when it matters most. They spent the next hour catching up on the intervening decades. Clyde had continued his botanical research work, eventually settling in Albuquerque with his wife and 2 children. He had always wondered what happened to the desperate man he had rescued in the mountains, the one searching for his missing sisters with such fierce determination. I never stopped looking, Tommy admitted. 40 years of following dead ends, false leads, hoping every indigenous woman I met might know something. I'd given up hope, honestly. Been sitting in that camper in Whispering Rock, just waiting to die. A nurse approached them, clipboard in hand. Are you the family of the patient who was brought in from Santa Dolorosa? Yes, Tommy said, standing quickly. How is she? The police are on their way to take statements, but I can tell you that we've successfully flushed the alcohol from her system with IV therapy. She's conscious and alert now. We're treating her injuries. She has multiple lacerations consistent with whipping, some requiring stitches. She's going to need time to heal, both physically and emotionally, but she's stable. Before Tommy could respond, commotion in the hospital's main entrance caught their attention. Joe, the tribal police officer, was entering with 2 women in black habits. Even across the lobby, Tommy recognized them immediately. Older now, their faces lined with years of hardship, but unmistakably his sisters. Sarah was the first to see him. She stopped walking, her hand flying to her mouth, tears immediately streaming down her cheeks. Ava, the youngest, looked confused for a moment before recognition dawned. All 3 siblings moved toward each other simultaneously, meeting in the center of the waiting room. Nazli, Tommy whispered, using Sarah's birth name as he embraced her. Aylin, he said to Eva, holding her close. Ashki Yaji, Sarah replied through her tears, using his Navajo name. We never thought, we never dared hope. They were all older now, Tommy 58, Sarah in her 50s, Ava approaching 50. But the emotional connection transcended the decades of separation. Tommy reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper he always carried, his pencil sketch from the boarding school. Do you remember this? He asked, unfolding the drawing carefully. The sketch showed Naomi braiding Eva's hair while Sarah sat nearby singing, and all 3 sisters gasped when they saw it. The image captured a moment of tenderness from their childhood that the boarding school's harsh regime couldn't completely destroy. "You drew this by candlelight in the dormitory," Sarah remembered. "After evening prayers, when the guardians weren't watching?" "Where is Elise?" Eva asked, using Naomi's birth name. "Is she?" "She's being treated," Tommy assured them. "She's going to be all right." Joe approached them, balancing professional duty with personal satisfaction. "We need to take official statements from everyone, and we need to understand what happened in 1945. State police are coordinating with federal authorities now. This case involves multiple jurisdictions and potential federal crimes." They moved to a private consultation room where Joe set up a recording device. Tommy and Clyde gave their statements about the day's events, describing everything from the church service to the rescue at Father Milford's house. Then it was Sarah and Eva's turn to tell their story. "What was happening that day in 1945? Joe asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath before beginning. Reporters and government officials arrived at St. Gertrude to tour the boarding school. We were scrubbed clean, given decent clothes, some borrowed from white church donors. They lined us up in rows for photographs, under the watchful eyes of the priests and nuns. Ava continued, "The youngest children drew the most attention because of our innocence and wide-eyed beauty. That's what they called it. The three of us sisters were photographed extensively." After the press session ended, Sarah said, her voice growing harder, Father Reginald Milford, the first Father Milford, approached us. He was a high-ranking priest, very respected. He told us that God had spoken to him directly and chosen us as favorites of the Holy Mother. Tommy felt sick as the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. He promised to guide us to meet with the Virgin Mary herself, Eva added. He said whatever we prayed for would be answered, that our salvation was guaranteed as long as we took vows of celibacy and silence. The boarding school guardians knew about this, Sarah continued bitterly. They walked us directly to Father Milford after the photographers left. We were terrified, but had been trained to be obedient. We followed him through the back halls to a basement prayer room. Joe's expression grew grimmer. What happened next? That very night, Father Milford drove us in an unmarked church vehicle to the compound near what was then called Cielo Seco, Sarah said. He left us with a cloistered order of Catholic nuns who answered to no one except their own leadership and donors. What was your treatment like at the monastery? Joe asked. Eva's voice became flat, emotionless. We were taught disciplined Catholic life, no talking, constant prayer. When we made any single mistakes, we had to strip naked in front of Father Milford while he told us we were sinful and needed to beg God's forgiveness. He would whip us himself, saying it was like Christ being whipped. We made many mistakes when we were young, Sarah added. The punishment was daily. Father Milford would see different young nuns every day for these correction sessions. As we got older and became indoctrinated into the silent life, we learned to avoid his attention. But he still used us, in a different way, Eva continued. We were forced to pray for countless requests, from clients, companies, people in positions of power who paid for spiritual guidance. We had to drink wine and perform modified Navajo rituals, then write down whatever divine messages we supposedly received. Joe looked up from his notes. This was about maintaining financial support for the operation? Yes, Eva confirmed. The combination of indigenous spirituality and Catholicism attracted wealthy donors who believed they were getting more powerful prayers. Tommy had been listening in growing horror, but one question burned in his mind. Why did no one ever find you? I searched for 40 years. Joe answered this one. In 1945, racial discrimination was legally sanctioned. Local authorities didn't care about missing Indian girls. Boarding schools regularly relocated children without notice, and tribal voices were systematically ignored. Your sisters were never formally adopted, transferred, or reported missing. The school falsified their records, Joe continued. They claimed the girls had been reunited with family, meaning they were supposedly placed with a white Christian family. With your parents dead and your father imprisoned, no one had the authority or resources to challenge the official story. "I kept that newspaper photo all these years," Tommy said, pulling out the worn clipping. "I suspected the journalists, the boarding school officials, random predators who might have seen the article. I never suspected the priest himself." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "The patient in room 12 is asking for her family. She's ready for visitors." They found Naomi sitting up in bed, looking fragile but alert. Her injuries had been cleaned and bandaged, and the IV in her arm was delivering fluids and medications. When she saw all three of her siblings together, she began crying again. "I can't believe this day has come," she whispered as they gathered around her bed. Tommy took her hand. "We were so close this morning at the church. You were standing right there by the prayer box. If only I had known." Naomi squeezed his fingers. "God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? Whether it was the Catholic God or our ancestral spirits, or both, they brought us back together. You received your answered prayer, Tommy, not in words written on paper, but in action." Eva looked thoughtful. "I still believe in Catholic teaching," she said quietly. "But these people, Father Milford and his followers, they perverted everything they claimed to represent, even contradicted their own teachings. They used religion to justify abuse and exploitation." Tommy nodded slowly. "Maybe after you all recover, we can learn the right way together. There must be a form of faith that doesn't require us to abandon our identity as Navajo people. But right now, I'm convinced that God, however we understand Him, has answered my prayer." As the four siblings sat together in the hospital room, 3 generations of trauma and separation finally beginning to heal, Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in 40 years: hope for the future and the profound peace that comes from answered prayers.